for being late.
No, it's fine.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. So welcome. My name is Sunita Nahar. I'm a project assistant at Scrap Weapons, and I'm studying a master's in international studies and diplomacy at SOAS. It's really great to have you all here. This is the third of our webinars looking at the debate on the emergence of a new Cold War. And the series as a whole examines US-Russia-China relations and the potential for an arms race. This webinar will contextualize the impact of emerging technologies in existing military tensions and how this has broadly contributed to the militarization of space. We're joined today by 5 fantastic speakers: Anuradha Damala, Jessica West, Almudena Azcarate Ortega, Eric Gomez, and Harry Spencer. Just before we start, I'd like to run through a little housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded and it'll be published on the Scrap YouTube channel in the next few days. Once all the speakers have given their presentations, we'll open up the floor for a question and answer session. We'd love to hear from you. Please add your questions via the Q&A function. If possible, it'll be great, really, to have your name and affiliation as well. And if you wish, you can start leaving your questions right now. Now, I'll hand you over to my colleague, Gemma, who will introduce you to Scrap Weapons.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Hi, everyone. My name is Gemma, and I'm also a project assistant at Scrap, as well as a student at SOAS in international studies. So a little introduction about Scrap. Scrap Weapons aims to reframe the debate around disarmament and to challenge the dominant strategic culture of production, trade, and supply of weapons that inevitably fosters new war, and which has direct impact on safety and development conditions on critical areas of the global south. The threat of global war looms, yet there is no practical strategy for weapons control. Scrap advances the disarmament agenda by way of providing the international community with both intellectual and practical tools for its implementation. These include a draft treaty for the realization of a legal commitment to nuclear and general disarmament in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and prototypes of a global weapons tracking system that provides transparency against illicit arms trafficking. At Scrap, we are now working to organize a conference on activating a 4th special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, to be hosted at SOAS University of London in September. UN special sessions devoted to disarmament were held in 1978, 1982, and 1988, but a 4th never transpired. We aim to build a global constituency to revive the debate on general and complete disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly in the near future, and we invite everyone to participate and support our work. We believe it is important that the debate around disarmament is not ignored by academic and policy experts, and that it is promoted in the agenda of foreign policy makers and think tanks worldwide, both intellectually and in practice. Scrap Weapons invites collaborations to support these processes. You can find more information on our website at the link that will be posted in the chat. Thank you very much.
Well, now let me introduce our first speaker today, Anuradha Damale. And Anuradha is a policy fellow and program manager at BASIC and a doctoral researcher on the EU-funded Third Nuclear Age project at the University of Leicester. Anu's work focuses on inclusion in international security, and her PhD research is on responsibility in outer space. She was previously researcher of VERTIC, chair of UK SEDS, the UK National Space Charity, and is currently the Director of Women of Colour, Advancing Peace and Security in the UK. She is a board member of the Just Space Alliance, and as a technical and policy expert, she focuses on applying systems theories to international relations and to technological and policy artifacts and environments. Anuradha, welcome.
Thank you so much, Sunita, for that lovely introduction. I always cringe very hard when people are reading out bios, but thank you regardless. As Sunita so kindly introduced me, my name is Anuradha, or Anu, and I'm a policy fellow at BASIC. And I want to begin by acknowledging that I know that this is a really difficult and draining time for everyone for various layered reasons. So thank you for making the time to be here today. I'm going to use my time to provide some seed ideas for discussion rather than go off in depth on any specific point. But these points will no doubt be brought up by the fantastic plethora of experts that I am absolutely flattered to join today. So I wanted to get the low-hanging fruit out of the way. The use of space for war is not new at all. And when we talk about emerging technologies, a lot of people sort of grimace or judge the use of that phrase, right? Because what does it even mean? And specifically, what does it mean in the context of war and of security? And in my view, the sort of accepted definition of it loosely is for technologies that haven't been fully realized or are relatively new or are continuing to develop as we innovate. And the sort of core of my seed of discussion, if you like, today, is that I strongly believe that discussing issues related to space and emerging technologies deployed within the space domain using traditional arms control arguments and frameworks is kind of a trap. It's an opportunity for posturing and statement making, but it's also detrimental to development and cooperation in the field. And I also believe that such approaches risk furthering power imbalances and structures within ground-based arms control that we already see. As someone who moved into the security space horizontally from science, policy, and physics, it baffled me how in-depth arguments and posturing surrounding sort of security issues were, but also how siloed off those arguments are from the rest of the economy. Especially, not to be cliche, but we live in a very connected world. And so when I came in and worked on nuclear, I started seeing this siloing, and my push was that we need more systems-based approaches to this issue. And that applies to space as well. Crucially, space is infinite, but usable space is finite. And while there are bodies of regulation that in principle should keep this finite resource safe, equitable, and usable, we don't see a universal sort of holistic uptake of existing regulation or implementation of that regulation, be that the registration convention or the space debris mitigation guidelines. Space is not sectioned off from the rest of the economy. It impacts our communications, our insurance sector, law, technology, the environment, and all of this really matters. An individual incident in space is connected so deeply in a national system of innovation or how different countries function. Coming to the importance of rhetoric, which is the second point that I want to sort of leave you with here today, and why words matter. Where there is a driver for a show of power, there is a risk of trying to run with no catch safe, because the idea of a race is so embedded within international dialogue. We see it all the time, space race this, space race that, and you'll see probably me and a couple of others on this call kind of calling that out and being like, please, can you stop calling it that? And we hit a huge stumbling block. Within science policy, there's this model of technological diffusion called the hype cycle, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And we've seen this been talked about in sort of military contexts, for example, in traditional military technologies such as nuclear weapons and their associated technology systems. Sensationalist press releases from governments, from very important news organizations or organizations in general that hold very large amounts of semiotic power in that their views influence society quite heavily, contribute to fear-mongering and the spread of disinformation, whether that be in the general populace or within stakeholders of military systems of different countries. So that could be private sector actors, banks, government officials, and they also undermine the existing regulation and international systems of governance even. But this also links with accessibility in a different sense. For different groups of people with different motivations, space warfare or other capability means something different. These differing perspectives are just as relevant because everyone is operating within the same limited domain. We can see from other fields the risk of imposing an unspoken set of rules that are set by great power countries that aren't communicable or feasible for other countries. Understanding why people do things is just as important as understanding how to undo them. So for instance, one country's access to space situational awareness technology might be critical because they are important military actors or quote unquote important military actors. But for country B, depending on space situational awareness technology from another country or the data from it could have a huge impact on their climate or energy security. And for this reason, regional and national capacity building efforts are incredibly important when it comes to space dialogue, not just where one country tells every other country what to do, but where there is a genuine exchange of information. Furthermore, coming back to this point where sustainability, safety, and security are interconnected issues, and definitely in space. Defining what a weapon is in outer space is a really tasking thing to do, but I think we can agree that a large piece of contaminated debris falling from a rocket landing on Earth, or an important military communication satellite being hit by a piece of debris is unsafe, and it destabilizes the space environment in very many different ways. Where there are conversations about behaving or carrying out activities responsibly, these cannot just be limited to aspects of security because they're connected to safety. As such, efforts need to be made to build capacity, raise awareness, and build knowledge bases and tacit knowledge in workforces and countries to make sure that everyone is involved in this conversation around space regulation. Everything is good for a while, and then a disruption occurs, and this thing is called punctuated equilibrium. When this disruption occurs, a window of opportunity arises. For instance, a significant risk from debris, an open-ended working group, such as the one that's coming up, or a huge war that is hugely dependent on satellite communications. You need enough social, political, whatever type of capital that you have to break that direction and change the direction and momentum of the conversation that's happening. My fear is that every time we have a conversation in space or a disruptive event that happens in space, when we do not take effective steps which consider everyone, we don't properly mobilize and we lose that opportunity. And so the window gets smaller and the weight needed to change the direction gets even bigger. So I'm going to leave everyone with that, and I'm very sorry I'm going to have to leave shortly as well, but I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the speakers' contributions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anuradha, and for pointing out the importance of space dialogue. Thank you.
I will now introduce our second speaker, Jessica West. So Jessica West is a senior researcher at the Canadian Peace Research Institute, where her research and policy work is focused on technology, security, and governance, with a particular interest in outer space. She interacts regularly with the United Nations and other international bodies tasked with space security and sustainability issues. Hand over to you, Jessica.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I took the theme for this series of talks, which is the possibility of a new Cold War, or great power politics reemerging, and sort of ran with it. And my pitch to you today, when I think about how this might play out in space and the importance of disarmament and arms control, is that I conceptualize space as a place, but a place that is a meeting point of old and new technology. And in my mind, it's this interaction of old and new that can create unexpected and potentially dangerous new outcomes that threaten peace and security. And I'm going to focus on some of the changes that have been driving this that I think threaten us in the future. And it will be from more of a traditional arms control perspective, but I take Anu's point very clearly about the need for dialogue. So as Anu pointed out, space is not new. It's not a technology itself. It's a domain in which states, commercial sector, exercise technical capabilities. But when you think to the previous Cold War, a lot of our iconic images are associated with space, with satellites and rocket launches and astronauts. These capabilities are etched in our minds and our memories of this era. And in some ways, this is part of old technology, not emerging technology. But at the same time, is a space in which more and more states and private sector organizations are developing new capabilities. It's also very much a place of new and emerging technology, and how those interact and meet might be unpredictable in the future. And my fear is that it has the potential to turn a power standoff from a Cold War to a hot one. And to explain this, I'm going to quickly touch on some of the changes that are driving this, the dangers associated with it, and I think a few areas where we can prevent it or work to do better when it comes to space governments. I think it's really critical to understand how space has changed rapidly in the last decade or so. Space is no longer viewed as a domain that is separate from Earth. It's never really been detached from Earth, but for a long time there was strong sentiment, particularly during the Cold War and post-Cold War era that, space was a sanctuary. It was detached from the politics on Earth in some ways. And of course, the International Space Station has been symbolic of a culture of peace and cooperation in space that could bridge geopolitical divides. And I think just this past week, we're starting to see how this is changing and shattering. There's, random comments about possibly dropping portions of the International Space Station on Europe. And even a few weeks ago, this sort of political fallout to that degree on the International Space Station was inconceivable. And so it's not special and it's not separate from what happens on Earth the way it used to be conceptualized as such. Even in when it comes to war fighting, there was thinking for a long time that space was too important for war fighting. And I think here again, you see another shift that is critical to how politics and power and warfare are changing when it comes to outer space. Space is increasingly viewed as a warfighting domain itself and features prominently in great power competition and possible confrontation. And I think people are keenly aware of the new rhetoric of war fighting in space, which sort of shatters this illusion of space as a sanctuary from violent conflict. But it's more than rhetoric. It's backed up with a decisive shift in how militaries are planning and preparing for future wars, very much with space in mind and with space at the forefront. We see this in Ukraine right now. If anyone's following the news, I'm sure we're all following the news, but there's been a lot of evidence about how important access to space is for the use of force. It provides intelligence, it provides signals intelligence as well as satellite imagery, precision and strike capabilities. We're hearing about jamming of GPS. But the shift towards warfighting is really about more than that. We've become so dependent on outer space for the ability to conduct warfare that there's a move towards defending or interfering with those systems themselves. And I think this is where some of the danger starts to arise. In the United States, there's clearly been a shift towards an extension of nuclear deterrence in space. And so that means that there's a possibility that nuclear weapons could be used in response to a significant non-nuclear strategic attack that includes outer space. And it's not clear what that means. And it's not just the United States that's part of this shift towards warfighting. China long ago established the Strategic Support Force, which integrates space, cyberspace, and electronic warfighting elements to function as part of what it describes as informationized warfare. And I think that brings us to the third change. Space is both old technology, it's a critical location, a function of nuclear command and control and our abilities to have early warning for possible nuclear attacks. And then it's also the presence of new capabilities. We have non-kinetic capabilities that put these critical functions in harm's way in a way that they simply weren't a few decades ago. Non-kinetic capabilities such as emerging cyber, laser weapons, possible microwaves, stronger electronic interference. These can all be used to reach strategic capabilities in space in a way that is very new. We also have advanced robotics and artificial intelligence capabilities that mean that other objects in space can now get close to one another and possibly threaten each other in a way that they couldn't before. And that's frightening because we don't know how states will respond if they feel threatened in space. I think we're starting to see some of that with the rhetoric this week as well when it comes to Ukraine. And so we kind of have this unpredictable powder keg that has been developing. And I think it's exacerbated by poor governance. It's exacerbated by all of the things that we don't have in space, which is adequate governance and arms control. In particular, the situation suffers from poor data sharing and lack of a shared picture of what's happening in space across different players. There's a near non-existence of communication capabilities with states other than allies. There's a lack of common understanding about what counts as risk or what counts as an attack. How does escalation work in outer space? And all of these flaws were on display recently with the diplomatic spat that has been taking place between China and the United States with regards to a Starlink satellite that China believes got too close to its space station. China has claimed that it sent several emails to the US Department of Defense, but didn't receive a response. And the US in turn claims that no, this was not a close call, either because it had different data or it has a different understanding of what counts as close, or both. This was dangerous because there are human lives on the space station, but imagine how much more dangerous it could be in the context of a conflict or a military crisis. So why does this matter? I think one thing I struggle with is making the prospect of conflict in outer space matter to people, because it might not seem like a big deal. To some, it seems maybe better to focus warfighting in a space that's further removed from Earth and from, a space that's populated with hardware and not human bodies. And I would say that this sense of distance from Earth is really an illusion. The consequences of a military confrontation in outer space would be devastating. The first possible consequence, which I've alluded to, but I think we're going to hear more about that from Harry later, is nuclear war. I mentioned the presence of extended deterrence. This means that a perceived strategic attack, however that is defined, could escalate to a nuclear response. And we have to remember that there are 12,000 nuclear warheads on Earth, maybe actually a few more, and most of them are kept on high alert. The other potential is for accidental nuclear warfare in space if there is some sort of interference with the capabilities that control those satellites and we don't know what's happening, and states get worried and react in a way that that escalates towards the use of nuclear weapons. But I think it's important to remember that war doesn't have to be nuclear to be devastating. Just yesterday, the head of Russia's space agency declared that any hacking of one of its satellites could justify war on Earth. And I think we're seeing how painful that kind of war is. Even kinetic violence in space would be devastating to civilians, or conventional warfare. There's no separate military zone for warfighting in space. Critical civilian infrastructure, which Anu did a wonderful job of reminding us about, is needed for healthcare and transportation and communication. The internet, we are very dependent on outer space, and all of these uses could be harmed in the event of warfighting from either space debris or secondary harm on critical infrastructure. So I like to visualize or conceptualize warfighting in space as urban warfare in a way, with lots of vulnerable targets that could and would be in the way. So what do we do about this? I think there's a lot that we need to do. Sort of a layered approach to governance is something that I've been thinking a lot about. I think the first step is norms, and there's a process coming up, an open-ended working group through the United Nations General Assembly that is set up to start working on this. But we need to articulate and reinforce key norms of behavior and make sure that those are shared across different space actors. And this could help with strategic stability. I think there's ample room to ban the most destructive weapons in space that create indiscriminate harm, such as kinetic anti-satellite tests. And I think that it's time to start having conversations about humanitarian protection in space, even though there are not that many human bodies there. Human dependence on continued access to space is absolutely essential for daily life. And so starting to talk about, rules for non-interference with critical infrastructure and how that might work is also a critical next step to avoid very terrible outcomes and make sure that we can continue to benefit and flourish as an international community in outer space. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for your intervention. I really like how you pointed out all the possibilities in evolution in technology, especially in outer space, and how the projection of power politics is really threatening. But hopefully, our countries will act together and collaborate, especially in outer space. Thank you very much. Back to you, Sunita.
Sunita, you're muted. Sorry.
Apologies for that. Let's now go to our next speaker, Almudena Azcarreta Ortega. And she's an associate researcher in the space security and WMD programs at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. Her research focuses on space security and missiles, and she's currently leading UNIDIR's participation in the open-ended working group in space threats, which was created under UNGA Resolution 231. Prior to joining UNIDIR, Almudena was as a research assistant at Georgetown University Law Center, where she's currently an SJD candidate. An SJD candidate is the equivalent of a PhD. She holds an LLM in national security law from the same institution. Almudena received her LLB from the University of Navarra. Almudena.
Thank you very much, Sunita. I'm really happy to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here. And I'm really honored to be sharing this panel with people that I admire a lot. So it's a pleasure to be here. Before starting, I have an obligatory disclaimer. I'd like to say that my comments and opinions that I share with you today do not necessarily reflect the views of UNIDIR or of the UN. Having said that, to avoid repetition with what has been said and with what might be said later on, I'd like to focus on my approach today. I like to focus it a bit more on the more legal side of things and perhaps a bit less on the policy. I'm really glad that both Jessica and Anu highlighted that, you know, space is a domain that is essential for everything that we do on Earth. And sometimes it seems that it's very far apart from everything that's happening on Earth, but it's not. The geopolitics of Earth really influence space activities, and vice versa. Space activities also have a huge impact on activities on Earth. And I think it was Anu that pointed out that space technology used in the military context is nothing new, despite the fact that we often give it this name of emerging technologies. In fact, I think it was in the 1990s that it was first used very actively in the context of military operations. And since then, it's kind of become the norm that any military operations will have some sort of space components. Satellites can be used for so many things, from imaging, telecommunications, to provide clear communication channels, high resolution maps, guide troop movements, so many things. And these are actively used in every military operations nowadays. Since then, you know, since that time in the 1990s, reliance on space for conflicts has only increased. And this dependence, not just for the security aspect, but also for the everyday, you know, civilian purposes, the fact that humankind is so dependent on space has it perhaps encouraged states to also develop technologies to protect their own assets, and to ensure that their own space assets are not threatened by competitors. So this results in the development and creation of what is known as counter space technologies. You probably have heard recently, you know, how these can be used. These can be, as Jessica pointed out, these can be kinetic, these can be non-kinetic as well, such as jamming or spoofing or cyber. And they obviously create a lot of uncertainty in the space domain and can contribute to, well, not can, they actually do actively contribute to the heightening of tensions between states. So in this, you know, after giving this like general context, I'd like to focus on three things that I think are key to the discussion that we're having here today. These technologies and the use that we give to these technologies have three dangers that I like to highlight. First of all is the blurring of the lines between the civil and the military uses of these assets. Sometimes you have the same satellite used for both civilian and military purposes. This is what's known as a dual use space asset. So this, this blurring of the lines might heighten tensions. The second thing that I like to focus on is the fact that space assets are often used by more than one stakeholder, and how this use by multiple stakeholders can affect international relations, especially in times of tensions. And an example of this would be in the context of an armed conflict, how this affects rules such as the rule of neutrality, which I will briefly explain what that is in just a little bit. And then the last thing I want to focus on is how the nature of this technology that both Jessica and Anu already explained, how this differs a bit from the traditional concepts that we have of military operations or of war. It's less, so to say, flashy. It's more that the attribution is a bit more difficult. How the nature of these technologies makes it hard to apply concepts of both law and policy that would make de-escalation possible. So how to determine when a certain action constitutes a use of force, for example. And I think Jessica gave this example of a country saying that they might consider the cyber attacking of a satellite a form of use of force or a form of armed attack, and what this means. So first of all, for the blurring of the lines between military and civilian uses of space assets, satellites used by commercial operators are often used to provide services to the military. In fact, it's been very common for many years for for the military to contract with commercial providers for them to provide certain services. And there is a growing trend of militaries outsourcing space services to these commercial actors, particularly in the sectors of satellites, communications, remote sensing, due to the fact that private companies have this specialized knowledge that is oftentimes better suited to develop and deploy certain types of space technology that the militaries might need. The result of this is what I alluded to before, is that many satellites are dual use, which means that you have space assets that can be used or are actively used at the same time or at alternate times, but it's just one satellite for both military and civilian ends. So an individual Earth Reconnaissance Center, for example, can provide data to a wide variety of military, civil, and commercial uses. And how does this contribute to tensions, or how can this affect tensions? So in times of peace, a competitor might know what a satellite is and what its characteristics are. It can do so by looking at public registration data, by using their own SSA information, etc. But it might not know why. So is the state that put the satellite in orbit going to use it for just strictly civilian purposes, or is it going to use it for operations that might potentially harm that competitor? And in the face of such uncertainty, which is in fact created by a great lack of transparency, this competitor might be encouraged to develop its own counter-space technologies, which would heighten tensions. And in times of conflict, once you already have an armed conflict, the laws applicable to armed conflict, which are also known as international humanitarian law, or IHL, these laws do not really contemplate the existence of dual-use objects. An object is either a military objective or it is not. So a military objective is, according to IHL, one which by its nature, location, purpose, or use can make an effective contribution to military action, and whose total or partial destruction, capture or neutralization can offer a definitive military advantage. So if a dual use space object is being used in this way, it becomes targetable. The country targeting it is not going to consider, oh, but at some point it's also being used for civilian purposes. And this can this can have very harmful consequences, considering what Jessica already explained. The fact that space technology often provides critical services and aids the support of critical infrastructure. So it can deeply affect our daily, everyday lives. Second of all, I want to talk about the fact that space assets are often used by more than one actor. And Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty establishes that states will bear responsibility for the activities of their nationals. This includes the space industry, which is increasingly active when it comes to space activities. And the participation, and I think we've seen it throughout these days, how it's very good that the industry wants to get involved in providing services, but sometimes if this offer comes in the context of an armed conflict, for example, depending on the form it takes, it could make this conflict, or it could actually endanger the state responsible for that private actor in space. It could endanger its position as a neutral. What does that mean? When you have two belligerents, A and B, if you have C offering services to just one of the belligerents, let's say, for example, A, it might mean that B would be entitled to target C because it's violating those neutrality rules. So in that sense, a stakeholder who is not a state and who is acting, out of a good intent could actually be unknowingly harming the state that the state where that private actor has registered its satellite. So it also, blurs the lines and can create a lot of uncertainty. Then the last thing I want to focus on is how new technologies sometimes make it unclear to apply these classic de-escalation concepts. So the laws and regulations that establish limitations and prohibitions relating to conflicts, like, for example, the UN Charter or IHL in general, were developed to be applied on Earth. The drafters weren't really thinking, oh, we're going to go to space and we might have conflict in space. So even though these laws actually do apply to space nowadays, because the Outer Space Treaty actually says in its Article 3 that all international law shall be applicable to outer space, sometimes it's not really clear, and different states and different stakeholders might have different interpretations of how this international law applies to space. I think Jessica and Anu mentioned the concept of use of force and the concept of armed attack. The prohibition of use of force is highlighted in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, and it prohibits the use of force against another state, but it doesn't actually define what this is. And there is no uniform definition among states of what this is, not even for us. So this becomes even more difficult when you translate it to space. Is any use of force unarmed attack, which under Article 51 of the UN Charter would allow a state to act in self-defense, or is a use of force something different than an armed attack? Does it depend on the scale and effect, as some scholars argue, or does it not? So it really, it really blurs the lines, and it contributes to create further uncertainty. And this is not just due to the technologies themselves, but also to how states interpret these concepts and these contentious ideas, not just because of how technologies operate in space, but also due to their own political interest and their own national security interests. There is an unwillingness of states to decide one way or another, sometimes because it would create a precedent. So if you have a state saying that a cyber attack to one of their satellites would constitute an armed attack that would legitimize them to act in self-defense, this is something that would entitle others to do the same in the future. And that might not be something that every state might want. So there is a lot of uncertainty and a bit of unwillingness to clarify this. But not everything is bleak. Jessica already pointed out to several efforts in the works to kind of create a bit more common understanding, to lend transparency to these conversations. And the one that I would highlight as the more important right now is the open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behaviors, created by Resolution 75/231. And the mandate of this open-ended working group is essentially to take stock of existing international laws, consider current and future threats to space systems by states, and on the basis of these analyses, make recommendations on possible norms that could make sure, or could start at least to lay the groundwork to ensure that space can be kept as a peaceful domain, and that this transparency that I've been speaking about, and that this common understanding can be achieved, so that these blurred lines start to disappear, and that these tensions at least can be contained or can be lowered. So that's all I have, but I look forward to questions and comments, and of course, you know, the interventions from the remaining panelists. Thank you very much.
Almudena Ortega, that was a really interesting talk, and especially about the rivalry between states' assets in space. Really interesting. Thank you very much for that.
We can now move on to our fourth panelist, Eric Gomez, who is the Director of Defense Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. His research focuses on nuclear stability, military strategy, and missile defense in East Asia. He is the co-editor of the 2019 book, America's Nuclear Crossroads, a forward-looking anthology. In 2020, Eric was a member of the Nuclear Scholars Initiative at the Center of Strategic and International Studies, where he authored the research paper on the impact of intermediate-range conventional missiles on US-China nuclear stability. Over to you, Eric. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all, and thanks for having me. I must say that a lot of the previous speakers have very nicely preempted a lot of some of the things I was going to say, but that's good. I like that we're all going to be hitting on such similar topics here. So as Gemma said, my interest is primarily in missile defense and the sort of non-nuclear systems and how they impact nuclear stability, which is very important for any discussion of trilateral, you know, US, China, Russia relations in a new Cold War in the 21st century. And, you know, as such, I think what I'm going to do is start looking at the missile defense issue wider first, and then narrowing down into the strategy. And as other panelists have said before me, you know, space isn't really a new domain. Well, neither is missile defense. Right? Missile defense and its impact on nuclear stability and deterrence and arms control has been around since the early 70s, even earlier really, but since the early 70s when the ABM treaty went into effect, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, because of this relationship between defense and offense, right? And that the idea that you couldn't really limit offensive systems unless you also limited defensive systems, because then whoever has the advantage in the defense can take the mutual reductions in offense and use it to their advantage. So I think that this is an important context to consider. And as we talk about space and how space is used, especially for great power warfare and military strategy, I think you can see this sort of offense-defense relationship and this, as Almudena said, like this sort of blurring of lines and lack of clarity. So to give a quick overview of where missile defense is now among the three great, you know, among like the three powers we're talking about, the US, Russia, and China, the US definitely has the most developed missile defense capabilities of the three. It has homeland and theater missile defense systems. The homeland systems are not very reliable. The theater capabilities are generally better and forward deployed around more places in the world. Russia has nuclear armed interceptors around Moscow, fun relic of the Cold War there, and is sort of improving tactical and theater systems, but it's more of a positive externality for them from long-range air defense, right? Some of their longer-range surface-to-air missiles have a nascent anti-ballistic missile capability, but it's not really as purpose-driven or specialized as the US system. And the Chinese of the three are sort of the least developed, but they are sort of conducting some initial experiments into mid-course intercept systems. I think this is mostly to do with anti-satellite, more so than missile defense itself, which I'll get into a bit later. And the way that this works, or the way that missile defense works in great power competition or new Cold War, is that it creates these sort of threat perceptions that are very much out of line with the technical reality of the systems, right? The United States cannot escape mutual nuclear vulnerability with anyone right now through development of missile defense because the systems are not reliable enough, they're not numerous enough, and that's not really what they're for. However, Russia and China see the development of them and they think about the future, right? They think about how long will that be the case and will there be a technical breakout? They think about how the US uses missile defense in political competitions and tries to build networks of alliances and deepen them via forward deployment of these systems. And there's also this idea of, using missile defense in conjunction with non-nuclear systems to threaten the nuclear forces of another country without crossing the nuclear threshold. China is especially worried about this because their arsenal is so much smaller than the United States. They don't want to be in a position where the US uses a combination of missile defense and offensive systems to, plank its nuclear forces and take them out of the field. China wants to prevent that from happening. And these are important because threat perceptions drive decision making, right? We're seeing that in Ukraine right now, where when Putin sort of gave his reasons for wanting to attack, he had a lot of threat perceptions that I would say are just not in line with reality regarding, Ukraine. I think he said Ukraine was developing nuclear weapons or other WMD, very reminiscent of the 2003 justifications for the US attacking Iraq. And he was also talking about Aegis Ashore sites in Poland and Romania. And I think this is important because, when threat perceptions drive behavior, you get into things like how the Chinese and the Russians are thinking about changing their own nuclear forces, how they're developing penetration aids, hypersonic glide vehicles, that sort of thing, and also how they use peacetime political pressure or decision making. And I said this should go both ways, right? Because the US also has threat perceptions of China and Russia that are also driving our things, so you get into a sort of feedback loop. And to bring it back into outer space a bit, just to hit on a few of these points, some of which have already been raised, but if you have a missile defense capability, especially if you have mid-course intercept out in outer space, you have a nascent anti-satellite capability. This is why India's test of a missile defense I forget how they framed it, but a few years ago, India tested something that shot down a satellite, and India presented it as, I think they did present it as like an anti-satellite test, but that, you're most of the way there to a missile defense capability, and vice versa, and especially in low Earth orbit. Other things about missile defense in space, space-based sensors are essential for a missile defense kill chain, right? You need to see, if you want to have the best shot at intercepting a missile, you want to see it launch. So you want to have good early detection out in outer space, even if most of the radars and the stuff that does the sort of fine tuning of the guidance of the interceptor is either Earth-based or on the interceptor itself. You need the space systems to detect the early launch and also communicate amongst the different components of the system. So having that creates some interesting questions about stability and escalation. Again, as Amadena pointed out about the blurring lines, one of the things that the Missile Defense Agency in the United States has talked about is the idea of hosted payloads, right? The idea that you put a missile defense sensor on a commercial satellite And that helps you with getting that sensor picture in the early stages. Raises the question of, do those satellites now become legitimate targets? And what does that mean for preventing attacks on them? Also, space-based sensors are really important for the conduct of modern conventional precision warfare. And James Acton has talked about this in an international security article from a few years ago, but this idea of entanglement of nuclear and is not only a sort of blurring of the line between military and civilian or commercial, it's also a blurring of the line between nuclear and conventional, where the same satellites that are used to do conventional military things are also the things that provide early warning of nuclear attack on homelands. And if more countries are developing launch on warning, as the US military worries that China might be doing, then that makes these sort of operations more risky if they go after something outer space. So I think as I'll sort of wrap up with some questions. You know, I think a key thing which some of my other panelists have raised is, you know, what are the ways to make space sort of less prone to escalation and less dangerous? In the context of a new Cold War, I think the big challenge is, how do you get countries that view themselves in serious competition with one another to cooperate? And it's not impossible, because we did do it with the Soviets in the Cold War with you know, arms control and SALT and START near the end, and the INF Treaty, but it was very hard to do. So it's not impossible, but it's very difficult. And I wonder if some of the things that we're doing now will make it more difficult. But also, you know, and this is something where I think, you know, might go a little contrary to the general spirit, but how do you think about this stuff in terms of deterrence? Because in deterrence, the risk is the point, right? And so if you want to, there's an aspect here of, if you want to prevent an adversary from taking certain actions, then creating risk and building risk of their action into the system could be the way to do that. And I think that when great powers especially think of these challenges, they might be thinking more in that space, which again, I think only makes this question of, well, how do you make it less dangerous tougher? Again, I don't think impossible, but I think as we as a community of academics, policy analysts, scholars, and advocates think about how to deal with these challenges, thinking through that end of the spectrum is important too. Because if you want to like convince the big players to come along, I think that sort of aspect, I don't know if you can ever address it, but or resolve it, but thinking through it in those terms would be helpful. So with that, I will end my comments.
Thank you very much for your intervention, Eric. And thank you very much for your insights on missile defense, threat perceptions, and all the dynamics of deterrence. Also, the way you put out these questions at the end give us a lot to think on. Thank you very much.
Okay, let's go to our final speaker now. And Harry Spencer is a postgraduate scholar at the University of Birmingham, currently completing a master's in international relations. He's a graduate of the University of Leicester. Harry's research focuses on nuclear strategic theory and the security implications of emerging technologies. His recent work includes the publication of an in-depth study into the effectiveness of the current generation of missile defense systems with British pugwash. Harry.
Thank you very much, Sunita. Now, I am the only one, but I have brought along a few slides with me to share with you all today. So I'm going to bring those up for everyone now. Can I have like a little audio visual confirmation that you can see those from anyone? Yeah, wonderful. Brilliant. So of course, I think I should start off with saying hello. And of course, thank you to Scrap Weapons for giving all of us the opportunity to come and share some of our work with you today. And of course, thank you to my fellow panelists whose content of their talks has actually done a great deal of work in setting the context for what I'm about to talk about today. Now, as was mentioned there, my research focuses predominantly on nuclear deterrence and warfighting. And many of the technologies that I work on at university and outside university is what I'm going to be talking about today. So we're going to spend this final presentation talking a little bit about strategic non-nuclear weapons, strategy, escalation risks, and arms control. And the big focus for today will be exploring where these systems fit within contemporary nuclear strategy, how they disrupt the way we can think about and deploy nuclear weapons, and what the ramifications of that are on nuclear risk and arms control. Now, taking a look at the themes, we'll start with a brief introduction, and that's going to be followed what I think is an essential overview of the fundamental strategic framework that exists around some of these new and upcoming systems. We're then going to turn to escalation avenues and risks, focusing on the kind of real tangible realities of how real life use of these systems presents, some slippery slopes to escalation and potentially nuclear first use. This is then, of course, followed by a look at what it means for arms control. Some of the big questions here include, what are the barriers for or to getting countries that are becoming increasingly anxious about their nuclear survivability? How do you get them to commit to nuclear non-proliferation? And in what ways can we begin to kind of craft a framework for managing the spread of some of these technologies? And then, of course, we'll wrap up just at the end with a few of my concluding thoughts. That is working, wonderful. Now, the last few decades has overseen what is simply an explosion in the number of technologies that can be applied in ways that produce nuclear strategic outcomes without necessarily needing the direct application of nuclear weapons. And that is effectively the basis of what strategic non-nuclear weapons are. They are a collection of technologies that can be used and employed by actors for large-scale strategic objectives, often with nuclear relevance. Now, one of the big points of contention here is, of course, and this was mentioned by some of the other panelists earlier, that a lot of these technologies and the risks that they present aren't particularly new. Things like anti-satellite weapons, precision-guided munitions, and even some of the things Eric mentioned, like missile defense, from their conception are actually decades old. But what we're seeing now is that the relevant technologies needed for some of these systems and some of these capabilities has matured. And in many ways and in many cases, they've become reliable enough to take threats that were once conceived on paper and actually turn them into material reality. And this leads me to what one of the big overarching themes is of my talk, and that actually the key difference between now and past decades is the nuclear nations no longer see eye to eye on a lot of these technological threats and vulnerabilities. The calculations on what threatens deterrence, mutual vulnerability, our ability to defend ourselves have broadened, and we aren't all seeing eye to eye or getting the same answers anymore. And as we'll see, this has serious ramifications for existing tensions and risks, and also on our prospects for actually achieving meaningful progress in arms control. Now, the current nuclear world still operates on largely the same essential tenets as it did previously, but at a very basic level, the problem now is that the number of systems that actually have nuclear strategic relevance has dramatically increased, and in a collective fashion. The nuclear powers really are struggling to agree on the fundamental strategic purpose of these systems and how we should actually accommodate them within our security architecture. Now, for me, as someone who studies nuclear deterrence and warfighting, any conversation on the impact of strategic non-nuclear weapons and their implications for escalation arms control has to be preceded by an understanding of the fundamental logic as to why and how they relate to these age-old ideas, and also how we go about deterring aggression through threat of force. And a trap that I fear we often fall into, and this is kind of, I'd say, capitalized on by the media, is that we often tend to dismiss the acquisition of a lot of these technologies or systems as deliberately escalatory or actually destabilizing. And in my opinion, that couldn't be further from the truth. Every nuclear power works within its own strategic consciousness. That considers some actors as threats and others as not, and some technologies as threats and others as not. If you are a nuclear power, for example, and your main rival develops what appears to be a missile defense network, pursuing novel delivery systems is actually a means and rational way of reclaiming some of that mutual vulnerability. And again, this is all kind of what I'm trying to get at, in the sense that the fundamental difference at play now is that the answer to whether missile defense enhances deterrence or undermines mutual vulnerability, and again for other technologies as well, completely depends on who you're asking. So that leaves us now on escalation and risk reduction. Now, some brilliant work's been done on escalation implications, and many of these technologies have already been observed in quite good detail. Actually, one of the papers that Eric mentioned is actually cited just on the top there by Acton. And something to bear in mind is that many of these technologies merely expand existing threats or existing avenues for escalation rather than create new ones. So one example that comes to mind is the issue with hypersonic weapons and payload ambiguity. We've never really been able to know for certain what any dual-use weapon is carrying. The problem hypersonics create is that they compress that decision-making time, which altogether creates a more risk-prone environment. So some of these technologies aren't carrying inherent risks themselves, they just expand existing problems. Now, one of the key realizations being made here has a lot to do with interconnectivity and the mutual dependency of military hardware and systems. This was spoken about just previously by one of my other panelists who spoke about the kind of overlap between military and civil systems. If there's one big difference that we can draw between the modern battlefield and the battlefields of a few decades ago, it's that so much of what we deploy for conventional purposes actually has dependence on nuclear relevant systems and infrastructure. In particular, things like, again, as Eric mentioned, certain satellites, particularly satellite communication systems, early warning radars, and other computer related systems are all going to be key targets in normal conflicts because of the utility that we find in attacking them. The risks there come from how those attacks are interpreted when they come. It is immensely difficult to credibly communicate the purpose and intent of your strikes once basically the stones start flying. And when you do something like launch a cyber attack for the purpose of achieving conventional military gains, that doesn't look like you're trying to do it from conventional ends. It looks a lot like a disarming first strike, especially when you use a lot of these technologies in conjunction with each other. Now, I always try to give a silver lining to every dark cloud, and in this sense, there are some cautious causes for optimism. The first is that many of the previous mechanisms and ideas that we can port over from the Cold War for risks and crisis mitigation are still here today. We can set up cyber hotlines, is something that's been thought about before. We can communicate red lines and establish common understandings of what we simply will and will not tolerate being attacked. And second as well is that we can also make efforts to voluntarily mitigate some of those risks and that overlap. One again that springs to mind is deliberate redundancy, making efforts to basically disconnect as many conventional systems from nuclear systems as we physically can. And there's also political aspects to this as well. You can enforce executive oversight procedures. So attacks which come with risks of nuclear escalation, let's say like cyber attacks, have to go to a civilian government. And there have to be kind of executive oversight as to whether those attacks can go ahead. So last but not least, this brings us to arms control and the barriers and prospects for that. And this, and what I mean by arms control here is mostly to do with limitations and controls on these technologies themselves, but also traditional nuclear weapons limitations and management too. Now, there is no hiding it. Arms control has certainly taken a hit in probably the last 5 or 10 years. We do have what appears to be a major trend towards proliferation once again. Particularly in the cases of China and the UK, we have the gradual evaporation of a lot of our kind of, not archaic, but existing Cold War frameworks for arms control. And I think worse yet is the fact that our window for dialogue and engaging other powers for these sort of issues does appear to be closing, as countries are really struggling to motivate themselves to limit these systems, particularly the more they worry about their nuclear survivability. Now, I've mentioned a few just on the left-hand side there, but for me, one of the major barriers for arms limitation is that actually some countries are in some sort of an arms race mentality. And one of the byproducts of that is that countries that think they're winning or losing with regards to specific technologies will actually be motivated away from arms control and any attempts at limitation. It's very, very hard to convince a country to limit, let's say, hypersonic weapons when it's already spent billions on developing them, and they actually consider themselves to be in the lead of that specific technological race. Equally, it's very hard to kind of limit the runner-up as well when there's a strong strategic imperative to keep pursuing a technology, especially if they believe that technology to produce some sort of strategic parity as well. Now, not all of these technologies come with, common ground, which is one of the bigger problems when it comes to achieving meaningful progress in arms control. And one of the issues that we need to address as well is also for the fact that, I've got my timer's running out there, I am conscious on time, I'll bring it forward, is the fact that a lot of these technologies are actually now integrated into the doctrinal and strategic postures of these nuclear powers. So what you're asking for now isn't merely a reduction in missile defense assets or any simple limits on their use. You're actually asking for something of a complete redrawing of US or Russian or Chinese strategy. And that for most nations is absolutely unpalatable. But again, not all of these threats or technologies come without common ground. And one example, as you noted just under the areas of progress there, is that the implications of certain technologies are a big enough threat to more actors for multiple people to basically be motivated to limit them. Again, one example could be the use of large-scale anti-satellite weapons, which basically threatens every state that has space-based infrastructure, or the implications of AI integration into command and control. And that's something that I'd imagine a lot of states would probably like to avoid. Now I'll try and pull this over. There we are. Wonderful. So this brings us over to my final thoughts for today. And the first among such is that because we have so many different ideas on what these systems mean to us, there is no blanket solution for these issues. The disparity between the nuclear powers on the strategic utility of these systems is really at the center of this issue, which brings me to my second point, that it's possible that the best approach to these issues in terms of arms control and risk mitigation is actually bilateral. An approach where states basically pursue multilateral dialogue and we do large-scale discussions on what the common vulnerabilities are, but then states take it upon themselves to pursue bilateral negotiations to mitigate their respective concerns in relation to one another. Now, finally, and we did agree to end this actually on a positive note, but the difficulty in pursuing arms control has really, well, it's basically gone through the roof. And frankly, there are mountains to climb when it comes to managing not only these systems, but also managing the impulses of countries who see their or perceive their stockpiles as being vulnerable. And their answer to that is actually to proliferate, to find security and kind of numerical superiority. Now, as I said before, it's not impossible. Progress in these areas is definitely there. And I think we do have some sort of framework for that. But things have indeed, I'm afraid, just gotten a little harder. And I know I'm over time, so I will wrap up there. Thank you ever so much for listening. And I look forward to hearing some of your questions. Thank you. Sunita, you are on mute just now.
Apologies, for some reason I'm having problems with that. I was just going to say, Harry, thank you very much for your talk there. And I thought it was really interesting how you mentioned that changing the arms race mentality is going to be so important and vital for disarmament. So thank you.
Thank you very much again for all our panelists. We can open now the Q&A session. So we have a first question by Glenda. So Glenda writes, it has been noted that the amount of space debris around the planet could make travel into space impossible, thus confining us to our suffering Earth. I see the space station has made maneuvers to avoid being hit. What can be done about all the space debris?
So, yeah. Do you want me to go or not? Sorry.
I think Jessica, you showed an interest there, so yes, do go.
And then Alma will fill in all the details that I missed. Yeah, I think this brings us back to the point that Anu left us with before she had to pop out, which was questions about safety and sustainability and security being very much linked in space. And I think debris is the best issue to show this. We certainly do have a rising debris problem. You're right, it threatens the International Space Station. It threatens all satellites really and everything that is in outer space. I've heard debris referred to as sort of the landmines of space because they're equal opportunity threats to everything that comes in their path. And they don't have to be very big pieces to do a lot of harm. So what can be done? It's sort of a good news, bad news, maybe better news to come story. This is actually a key area where there has been international mobilization to try to prevent the creation of new debris. There are sustainability guidelines to mitigate debris. They've been adopted by the United Nations, and they're also part of the most recent voluntary sustainability guidelines. The problem is it's kind of a loose term. We talk about preventing long-term debris. And so there's different interpretations about what that means. And I think the biggest gap we have right now is really the intentional creation of debris. And we've seen a number of kinetic anti-satellite tests where you blow something up in space. That creates, that's probably the biggest hazard we have. China's anti-satellite test created the largest human-made debris cloud. And we've seen subsequent tests, even though we've committed ourselves not to intentionally create debris. And that's where you have this interpretation problem where, Russia had an anti-satellite test in November. It created debris. The debris threatened the International Space Station, but it argues it wasn't a threat. It wasn't a long-term risk. So I think this is actually an area where we need arms control. And there's growing interest among a number of states and within civil society to have a ban on kinetic anti-satellite testing. So to close that interpretive loophole and make it a black and white issue. And it would mirror in some ways the Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963, where states saw how terrible it was to have nuclear detonations in space, the harm that it did to everybody collectively, and moved to try to restrict that. So I think that would be, in my mind, a next step. And I'm going to put the link for the open letter in case people in the audience want to sign on, because anyway, they're still collecting signatures on that initiative, and it might be something you'd be interested in.
Yes, and I think Almudena had something to say on this as well.
Yes, thank you so much. I mean, what Jessica said is completely right. I absolutely agree with everything she said. Just a couple of additional points. So she talked about the sustainability guidelines, the space debris mitigation guidelines, which are guidelines applied more on the safety side of things. So on the accidental production of debris in space. And then she talks about the intentional creation of debris, and that's the hurdle that we have to overcome right now, right? Actually, in the I think it was the 2013 GGE at the UN, the group of experts already came up with a sort of very basic guidelines that actually UNIDIR picked up later in one of our publications to determine like 3 basic guidelines of against these intentional creation of debris. So the first is no debris. If you can avoid it, just don't create debris because it's obviously very bad. If you have to create debris, make sure that it is at a low altitude so that it will, just return to the earth and be burned up in the atmosphere. And so it will not hopefully, cause any damage to any assets orbiting the earth. And the third guideline was notification. If you are going to carry out an activity that could cause debris, you should notify other space actors that have objects close to the object that you are thinking of disabling or whatever. And while this is a good step forward, I agree with Jessica that this is not enough. I think recent and not so recent events have highlighted that debris is really harmful. A piece of debris as small as 10 centimeters, which is tiny. It's like this. It can absolutely destroy a satellite. So, it's just don't do anything intentionally in space that can create debris. And I think this is a message that has really started to take on with not just civil society and commercial actors, but also with states, I think. And this is definitely a concern that was raised in the submissions to the Secretary General report that was published earlier last year during the summer. And I think this will definitely be a topic that will be discussed during the sessions of the open-ended working group that will be happening later this year. So, I mean, I remain cautiously optimistic that this is something that the international community might be able to agree on in the near future. Whether the nature of this will be binding or non-binding is yet to be seen, but there is definitely an interest by states to ensure that this stops being a problem.
Thank you, Almudena. I just wondered, I wanted to pose a question myself to the panel, and I'm interested to hear how much was it a setback to disarmament that China actually tested a hypersonic missile?
Well, I don't think the US needed additional reasons to modernize the nuclear force, but I mean, I think the summer 2021 revelations of both the silo fields and the test that you referenced, Sunita, are basically guarantee that Congress is going to do US nuclear modernization. So yeah, I think that's a big one. And the nuclear aspect of the US-China competition becoming more salient is going to, I wonder if in the medium term it will create some interesting opportunities to talk with the Chinese about arms control, because it's something the US has said we're interested in for a while, but China hasn't really reciprocated, in part because they see the imbalance as being too unfavorable to them. And maybe, you know, that could be a silver lining, right? If you have an arsenal that's twice the size that it used to be, suddenly the prospect of negotiating limits seems less dangerous to the Chinese. But I do worry about the road you take to get there. So yeah, it wasn't. I don't think it was very good news, at least in the near term. Oops.
I think Harry, you'd like to add something to that.
Yeah, of course. So I think it's a really good question. What I'm basically going to do is piggyback off of what Eric said there, and I think one of the ways you could maybe reframe it is it depends what kind of like arms control it is you're talking about. If you're talking about hypersonic weapons with reference to nuclear proliferation, the problem is it shouldn't. Generally speaking, this was basically summarized in a really, really good paper that Dr. Blethyn-Bowen and Cameron Hunter put out at Leicester after the Chinese basically tested that FOBS system, or however you want to define it. And basically the conclusion they came to is that, you know, to put it in a very kind of blunt, cynical way, you know, delivering a nuclear weapon in a very, very fancy way doesn't really make much of a difference, because China and the United States can already effectively annihilate each other. Right? So if you actually look at the material reality of it, it shouldn't make much of a difference. And this is kind of what I was getting at in the presentation, that actually our perception of these technologies plays a very, very big role. And actually our perception of how effective and how much of a difference they make plays probably a bigger role than the actual material capabilities. Yes, hypersonics are interesting, and the kind of technical engineering aspect, at least, is something to be, I suppose, commended. But when you actually look at the nuclear strategic implications of that, hypersonics will not be a silver bullet. And if we're going to turn this conversation into like filtering down into other areas like missile defense, if there was any illusion that the United States was going to eventually cede a lot of its progress in missile defense and maybe come to the table on it, I think that is now an illusion. And I think one of the reasons for that is, one, because the United States has effectively just been given a reason to go to Congress, go to the public and saying, look, this is what the Chinese are developing. This is what the Russians are developing. We have to push forward with missile defense. Otherwise, US cities are at stake. And the second reason as well goes back to what I said earlier about actually some of these systems and some of these technologies are now so integrated and now so essential to a lot of the warfighting strategies of the United States. If you look at air-sea battle, part of that first phase of air-sea battle, that kind of survival phase, a big part of that depends on those missile defenses in Guam, at Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa, and all those air force bases and naval stations in Japan and South Korea actually doing their jobs. And there's no way now that we can basically turn to the United States and go, look, like your missile defense is causing people to develop hypersonic weapons, because they'll go, well, too late. We need our bases to survive if we're going to fight conventionally. So we're in this really, really weird and uncomfortable nexus where, you know, maybe the answer to that question is, you know, it's gone beyond that. It's gone beyond whether individual developments now trigger outcomes. It's about the huge doctrinal and strategic postures that these two powers are pursuing. But it will always remain an interesting question. But, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's scary that, you know, that China and the US can actually annihilate themselves. Jessica, you wanted to add something to that.
Well, just that it's an interesting question. And I think Eric and Harry have pointed to what Paul Meyer has called to as the devil's triangle between missile defense, nuclear, and space. And when we think about governance mechanisms or arms control going forward, part of the challenge is to remember that space is not separate. And so how do you integrate those conversations with some of these other issues? And as Eric, he pointed to the ABM treaty, 1972, I think, that was eventually abrogated. But again, you see this huge knock-on effect in terms of the creation of anti-satellite capabilities linked to a missile defense agreement. And so being able to see the big picture and have people who can have conversations across the different technologies, I think, is important.
Thank you very much, all of you, for your interventions. We have a next question in the Q&A by Riz, and I read, what hopes are there for arms control among the great powers given Russia's invasions of Ukraine and willingness to use massive force?
We were just talking about this. So I hosted Ambassador Meyer last Friday on Space Cafe Canada. So we were talking about this because his role for many years was as Canada's top diplomat on arms control and disarmament in Geneva. And so his response is that on the one hand, there's a lot of talk about how this is going to impede maybe further arms control agreements, but his experience in the past also shows that sometimes crises can bring opportunities for renewed discussion. But above all, I think, whether or not we hope something will happen, the importance of maintaining those diplomatic discussions at all times is absolutely essential, because it's only through diplomacy will we have off ramps to that conflict. And what worries me is sort of seeing kind of escalation of cutting people out of conversations if they're Russian, or punishing states through the removal of diplomats. And I think that it's during crises that we really need to maintain communication and continue doing the work that we do, so that when the right moment arrives, we have solutions in place and we can move quickly. And so that's sort of my answer to how do you work in civil society on issues that take forever and never seem to progress until they do. And you never know when that until they do moment will arise.
Thank you very much. Eric, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, so I agree with Jessica about the prospect for an opportunity. What was interesting in the lead up to Putin's invasion, when the US and Russia were sort of exchanging these diplomatic written messages about ways to diffuse the situation, the US actually did put on the table inspections or CBMs, confidence building measures related to Aegis Ashore sites, the missile defense sites in Poland and Romania, which is something that the Russians had been angry about for a long time. And, I think it didn't, ultimately the Russians said, you didn't address the NATO concern, plus all this other stuff that Putin sort of talked about that were really outside of, I think, rationality. But, that it was interesting that they acknowledged oh, we appreciate your willingness to talk about the missile defense side. So I do wonder if that does present somewhat of a silver lining of well, how do you move forward from the crisis and what comes next in terms of getting the US and Russia back on track. I'd also say that, Russia was involved. We've had situations where the US and Russia / Soviet Union have been involved in conflict with one another and still were able to do nuclear arms control, right? INF treaty when Russia is in Afghanistan and the US is supplying the Mujahideen. The Vietnam War and the START or the SALT process, right? So it's not impossible, but I think figuring out the de-escalation pathway to end the conflict is going to be really important here. I just saw right before we got on this that the House Armed Services Committee Chair, Representative Adam Smith, talked about there isn't a de-escalation pathway right now. Being very honest about yeah, there's no real way right now that we're thinking of ending this conflict. So we got to figure that the US and Russia / NATO need to figure that out. And Ukraine too. So yeah, it's still pretty dicey, but all hope is not lost.
I don't think we've got any more questions, and I think we're coming to the end of our webinar. I'd just like to say Anuradha Damala, Jessica West, Almudena Azcarata Ortega, Eric Gomez, Harry Spencer. Thank you very much. Gemma, if you'd like to say anything, that would be great.
Yes, I would like to thank everyone for today's discussion, and to remind you that if you want to stay up to date with our work and join our newsletter, you can follow Scrap Weapons on social media. Also want to remind you that a video recording of this webinar will soon be available on Scrap's Weapon YouTube channel. And thank you again for your participation.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.
Take care. See you later.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Almudena. Bye, Jessica.
Well done. That was great. Fantastic. Really enjoyed it.